If you ask the general public about drug cartels in Colombia, they will name the Medellín Cartel and possibly the Cali Cartel. These two organizations were made famous by the popular Netflix series Narcos and represent the whole picture for the average person, that Cali and the Colombian cartels have finally fallen. However, as our viewers know, nothing is final in the world of drug trafficking, and one group is inevitably replaced by another. The same rules apply in Colombia. The Cali Cartel destroyed Medellín, but they themselves were destroyed by the Norte del Valle Cartel, which we'll discuss today. This organization started out as members of Cali, but eventually took its place, becoming the most powerful player in the Colombian drug market at the end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st centuries. They supplied cocaine all over the world, had their own private armies, and plunged the country into a horror of violence comparable to that perpetrated by Los Zetas during the same years. If you're interested in learning more about them, then meet the Norte del Valle Cartel on the other side of the law. Our story begins in the late 1990s, after the leaders of the Cali Cartel decided to move away from criminal activities and become law-abiding businessmen. But we'll start much earlier, because without a global understanding of the history of Colombia and its criminality, our story will be less comprehensible and incomplete. Let's go back to the 1920s. The world is experiencing a growth in demand for coffee, which accelerates the industrialization of Colombia, a country rich in this crop. Against this backdrop, a class of wealthy people is growing, who become the country's elite. They can be divided into landowners, those who produced agricultural crops such as coffee, vegetables, and fruits, and those who sold them, distributors. The elite quickly gained power in their regions equal to that of the state, often having their own armed forces to protect it. Naturally, politicians had to take this into account in the struggle for control of the country, and the political landscape naturally formed in such a way that the Colombian Conservative Party defended the interests of wealthy landowners, while the Liberal Party defended the interests of distributors. When issues could not be resolved peacefully, politicians and economic elites fought each other through peasants recruited into militias. Clashes between supporters of the two parties became particularly fierce starting in 1930, after the conservatives lost control of power and reached their peak in 1948 when Jorge Gaitan, a liberal presidential candidate popular among the common people, was assassinated. The public believed he had been killed by the conservatives. This marked the beginning of the La Violencia Civil War, a protracted period of extreme violence, mainly between rural residents. The conflict continued until the 60s and claimed the lives of about 200,000 people. The confrontation resulted in a decision by the conservative and liberal elites of Colombia to share power. The National Front Pact required the parties to take turns in the presidency and divide all government posts equally between themselves for the next 16 years. This marked the beginning of several decades of power sharing until the mid-1980s. Formally turning the political system into a tool for achieving the goals of the upper echelons of society. But the National Front also contributed to the growth of the rebel groups in Colombia. Officially, La Violencia ended in 1964, but some guerrilla groups remained in isolated parts of the country, calling them independent republics. By the mid-1960s, the conflict had turned into a class war between the government and communist guerrillas. Thus, throughout the 20th century, Colombia was a seething cauldron of constant civil wars, and by the end of the 1970s, a third player had entered the field: smugglers from Medellín who had become rich from the cocaine trade. Initially, they were able to use their money to buy the loyalty of the elites, who simply turned a blind eye to the fact that they were poisoning their northern neighbors with white powder. At one point, they even joined forces against the guerrillas when the latter began kidnapping drug dealers for ransom and attacking their drug laboratories. But in the end, the dealers were unable to integrate into the established elites. As soon as Pablo Escobar, one of the leaders of the Medellín Cartel, became a congressman himself, Minister of Justice Rodrigo Lara Bonilla began to dig into his affairs, forcing Escobar to resign and continuing to expose politicians who took money from drug dealers. For this, he was killed, and Colombia plunged into a new phase of civil war, this time between the state and the Medellín drug cartel. Rejected by the establishment, Escobar made the fight personal. He presented himself as a populist persecuted by the political elite for his humble origins and efforts to help the poor. He mixed this with nationalist fervor, especially regarding sovereignty and the extradition of criminals to the US to stir up anti-government sentiment. We talked in more detail about how Escobar plunged the country into a new era of narco-terrorism in our video about him. Here, we'll just remind you that there were thousands of victims. Pablo's men killed police officers, judges, and politicians. They kidnapped the relatives of anyone who could influence state policy. But in the end, Pablo lost. Not only did the state and the US Drug Enforcement Administration turn against him, but so did those members of his cartel who had grown fearful of his paranoia, as well as the Cali Cartel. This alliance became known as Los Pepes. It was thanks to them that Escobar was killed, as we described in detail in our video about the Cali Cartel, which took the place of Medellín. The Cali Cartel was headed by 4 people: the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers, Gilberto and Miguel, Jose Santa Cruz Londoño, and Helmer Pacho Herrera. Unlike Escobar, they did not confront the state, preferring to buy everyone off and maintain the image of respectable citizens. In the northwest of Valle del Cauca department, whose capital is the city of Cali, they already had people who were affiliated with their cartel in the 80s. Basically, everything was concentrated around the very convenient port in the city of Buenaventura, which is still one of the most important hubs for drug transportation. When Escobar was killed, the Cali leaders became new targets for the DEA, and therefore the Colombian government, which was under pressure from US authorities. And that's when the drug traffickers from Valle del Cauca, or as they are commonly known, the Norte del Valle Cartel, had their moment of glory. It should be noted that they never called themselves Norte del Valle. This name was given by the DEA in order to somehow mark the group based around Buenaventura on the map. By 1994, the top leadership of the Cali Cartel had decided to turn themselves in to a Colombian prison so that they could serve their sentences in their homeland and avoid extradition with the help of their corrupt connections, hoping to end the drug war this way. But there was one mandatory condition: all major cartel members had to surrender. On January 22, 1994, the Cali Cartel leadership convened an expansive, large-scale meeting with their subordinate drug traffickers to announce the complete halting of drug trafficking in Colombia and the voluntary mass surrender to Attorney General de Greif. As it happened, most of the members of their cartel at that time were from Valle de Cauca. They stuck together and, as it turned out, no longer agreed with the position of their superiors, which they made clear when the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers, after their speech, gave the floor to anyone who wanted to speak. Don Gilberto, the Mexicans owe me $18 million. If we stop, will you pay me? Said one of them. Another said, Don Pacho, I owe your cooks almost $8 million. So are we even now, or what? Gentlemen, I just bought 6 planes for work. What should I do with them? Lamented another. I have a 12-ton shipment coming soon. Do you want me to cancel it? Asked yet another. As a result, chaos and confusion reigned at this drug summit. A decision seemed to have already been made, and the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers were used to their orders being obeyed immediately, but not this time. They were promised that, at most, the labs, runaways, and drug storage facilities would be removed from the Valle del Cauca region. But even that seemed like they were doing them a favor. After this meeting, the Cali Cartel leaders had to accept that while they were fighting Escobar, their former employees had gained so much power that they had become uncontrollable, and even worse, no longer considered them their legitimate bosses. The new balance of power looked something like this: Norte del Valle, taking advantage of the moment while the boss's forces were focused on Los Pepes, not only took over the business for themselves, but also formed new routes, acting in the style of their former bosses through corruption rather than narco-terrorism. At the head of the new alliance was a coalition of about 15 drug traffickers. These were Jose Orlando Henao Montoya, nicknamed the Overall Man, his brother Arcángel de Jesús Henao Montoya, nicknamed El Mocho, and their sister Lorena, Wilbur El Jabón Varela, a security officer, and the Orlando Henao's right-hand man, Ivan El Enano Urdinola, Don Efra Hernandez Ramirez, Andres Florica López López, Don Diego León Montoya, Juan Carlos Chupeta Ramirez, Luis Hernando Rascuño Gómez, and Victor El Químico Patiño. It's also worth mentioning Colonel Danilo Gonzalez, who was previously one of the main players in the hunt for Pablo Escobar, but now had his own cartel and would later become the political protector of Norte del Valle. In the criminal world, Gonzalez and his network of active and retired police officers eventually became known as the Diablos Cartel. The most notable figure at the time in 1993 was Jose Orlando Henao Montoya, who united all the traffickers from the north of Valle del Cauca. He was born in 1953 in Cartago, a town 180 kilometers, over 100 miles, from Cali. Nothing is known about his childhood and youth. But as an adult, Henao worked as a police officer, and in the 1980s he began to build his own drug network, based on reliable distribution channels and corruption at all levels of government and in the media. In particular, Henao established ties with the Mexican cartels of Beltrán Leiva, Tijuana, and the Gulf, successfully supplying them with large shipments of cocaine straight from the jungle. His fast fishing boats left the rivers on the Pacific coast and headed straight for the shores of Mexico. Many of these routes are still in use today. Moreover, Henao also understood the importance of expanding into Europe. The port of Buenaventura and containers of bananas and coffee from Colombia literally became symbols of the drug trade in the ports of the Old World. Thus, by the time the leaders of the Cali decided to surrender to the authorities, a group united under Orlando Henao had already formed within their organization, which took this event as a signal to act. Their bosses wanted to retire, which meant it was time for them to become bosses themselves. All they had to do was hasten the fall of the Cali Cartel. The Rodriguez-Orejuela brothers, sensing this turn of events, came up with a plan B for their defense, since the general surrender to the authorities had failed and, accordingly, the agreement with the Attorney General had fallen through. They sponsored the campaign of presidential candidate Ernesto Samper in the hope that he would help them resolve their issues, but this plan B turned out to be the beginning of the end. Right after the elections, which Samper won, the so-called narco tapes surfaced. Audio recordings confirming that Samper had taken money from the Cali bosses, and this created a paradoxical situation. Once he became president, he was forced to spend his entire term proving that he was not on the side of the drug traffickers. In this regard, Samper turned into the most predictable and convenient president for the Americans and Cali's enemies. Arrests followed. Former accomplices testified, and the leaders of the Cali Cartel ended up in prison. But the Cali leaders could still rule from prison, which meant they posed a threat to Norte del Valle, who were claiming leadership of the industry, so a war began. The first to be eliminated was Chepe Santa Cruz Londoño, who had escaped from prison shortly before. According to the official version, he was killed in a shootout with the police. According to the unofficial version, Chepe was tortured before his death by people associated with Danilo Gonzalez. The next blow was dealt by Orlando Henao Montoya, who organized an assassination attempt on William Rodriguez Abadia, the son of Miguel Rodriguez Orejuela, who took control of the cartel after the top brass were imprisoned. He survived, but was forced to act more cautiously. After that, Norte del Valle returned to the organization of the late Chepe Santa Cruz. His man, Jose Alcides Loaiza, wanted to take control of his former boss's interests. He was prevented from doing so by being shot in public. Miguel Rodriguez Orejuela, realizing that the remnants of his organization were suffering a complete collapse in the showdown with his former subordinates, took a very desperate step. He wrote a letter to the leaders of the Norte del Valle cartel, threatening that if they persisted in their intention to attack him, systematically destroying his people, and above all, if any aggression against his family was repeated, he would have no choice but to turn in all officials and members of state structures who had collaborated with Norte del Valle. After that, negotiations took place between the representative of Norte del Valle and Miguel Rodriguez Orejuela, which resulted in a truce. At the same time, Orlando Henao Montoya decided to strengthen his position within the cartel and deal with another influential boss, Don Efra, also known as Efrain Hernandez. A man named Fernando Cifuentes worked for Don Efra, who regularly lent him money at a low interest rate, and over time, Fernando's debt to Don Efra reached $20 million. Don Efra would not accept partial payments, and Fernando was unable to pay the full amount, becoming dependent on Hernandez. Don Efra was a peculiar man and took advantage of the situation to entertain himself by publicly insulting Fernando or even slapping him or kicking him in the butt. Henao Montoya decided to take advantage of this and told Fernando that he would support him if he decided to wash away the insult to his honor with blood. Cifuentes thought this was a great idea, and in November 1996, he went to Don Efra's office and killed him and his two assistants. Then he called Henao, told him everything, and went into hiding. Hernán Montoya, in the best Game of Thrones way, summoned the leaders of the Norte del Valle cartel and convinced them that Fernando had clearly gotten out of hand and needed to be eliminated. Cifuentes, trusting Hernán, told him where he was hiding. A team of sicarios then went there and killed Fernando. Thus, with one shot, Hernán Montoya eliminated his main rival in the struggle for leadership and strengthened the unity around him by dealing with the traitor. This finally united Norte del Valle, making them the most powerful Colombian criminal group in the period between 1997 and 98. While their main enemies were in prison and all matters had been settled, Hernán and his lieutenants Cuchilla, El Químico, and Chupeta decided that it was time for them to surrender to the authorities, serve their sentences in Colombia, and avoid extradition. They were confident that their connections in the prosecutor's office, the police, and the government circles would soften their prison sentences. On September 29, 1997, Hernán voluntarily surrendered to the authorities, intending, as he put it, to take a short 3-year vacation in the maximum security wing of the La Modelo prison in Bogota. On the outside, another important character in this story, Wilber Varela, also known as El Jabón, remained in charge of his affairs. He was born on November 6, 1957 in Roldanillo, Valle del Cauca. It's believed that in his youth he worked for the police, but there's no documentary evidence of this. He began his career in the criminal world working in the Cali Cartel's drug laboratories, gradually climbing the ladder and becoming one of its enforcers. By 1993, he had joined the Hernán Montoya gang, and by the time he was handed over to the authorities, El Jabón was the right-hand man of the head of the Norte del Valle. However, simply watching over his boss's affairs did not work out. Pacho Herrera decided to eliminate Varela. The reasons for this hatred are still shrouded in mystery. Either Varela's communist sympathies were involved and Pacho hated communists, or Pacho had made a deal in prison with 2 Norte del Valle members, Cuchilla and El Químico, and El Jabón, as a staunch supporter of Hernán, was getting in their way. Either way, Herrera hired a group of sicarios who caught up with El Jabón while he was on business. The killers eliminated everyone except for Varela himself. Later, 2 of them would be caught and, under torture, revealed the identity of the person who ordered the hit. A little later, rumors reached Hernán Montoya that Pacho wanted to start snitching to the Americans, including on the Norte del Valle cartel. In particular, Pacho wanted to turn in Orlando Hernán Montoya himself. It was a clear death sentence, which Varela carried out without delay. The murder took place on November 5, 1998. Herrera, as usual, went out with other prisoners to play soccer in the prison's common yard. Varela's men was already there with a weapon, which he used when the moment was right. Pacho's 3 bodyguards tried to react, but they were unable to do anything. Elmer Pacho Herrera died a few minutes later. Hernán Montoya, either out of pity or mockery, took one of Pacho's brothers under his wing, who was imprisoned with him, named José Manuel Herrera. He was nicknamed El Invalido, the Invalid, as after being wounded in the back, he could not walk and moved around in a special chair controlled by his right hand, which he could still move. On the day of Herrera's murder, demonstrating extreme cynicism, Hernán consoled José Manuel, telling him that Varela was out of control and that he would never allow the peace agreement reached earlier to be broken. He promised to deal with Varela and, if necessary, punish him severely. However, Hernán had underestimated El Invalido. A week later, he made his way to Orlando Hernán's cell with a hidden gun and killed the boss of the Norte del Valle cartel. Just like that, Norte del Valle was suddenly left without a leader and split into 2 factions. On one side was El Jabón's group. On the other were several major drug traffickers, Rascuño, El Químico, Chupeta, and Don Diego. Judging by the fact that the second faction included everyone who had been in prison with Pacho Herrera, the theory that Pacho wanted to make a deal with them and eliminate El Jabón carries weight. There had not yet been an open confrontation between them, but now there was no common leader either. For example, when Varela decided to continue the war with the clan of the late Pacho Herrera, led by his half-brother Tony and supported by the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers, the second faction simply stepped aside and did not interfere in the conflict. Varela emerged victorious from this, finishing off the remnants of the hated Cali Cartel. And then, following the logic of almost all videos about cartels, I should have told you how these factions began to fight each other, creating armed blocks like Los Zetas. No, of course that happened, But today's story is special because the fear of extradition and the constant pressure from the Americans forced these drug lords to become informants more often than ever before in the history of organized Latin American crime. Thus began a new chapter in this story, in which the Norte del Valle cartel turned into the Cartel of Snitches. The turning point was a U.S. intelligence operation called Millennium. The central role here was played by double agent Baruch Vega, nicknamed the Photographer. In fact, he was more of a triple agent. While gathering information for the DEA, he collaborated with drug lords, receiving millions from them, and then presenting them to the Americans as significant figures who were not worth worrying about. He passed on some of the money he received in this way to the CIA to finance their operations outside the United States. Thanks to his connections, Vega was able to warn his dealer friends about the upcoming secret Operation Millennium, and they avoided arrest. This made him even more important in their eyes, because almost no one knew about the operation. And then he put his plan into action. Vega told interested dealers that he had connections in the US with a special commission that included high-ranking officers from various agencies. They allegedly decided what the dealer's testimony was worth and what he could get in return. Vega promised that if the drug dealer paid him a large sum of money, he would put in a good word for him, and after giving testimony, he would be able to serve a couple of years, come out completely clean before Uncle Sam, and keep all his money. However, Vega only lied about the commission and his ability to influence it. Otherwise, he gave the dealers the real names of DEA and FBI officers, judges, and prosecutors. In short, everyone who would be involved in their cases. Any drug dealer could verify the existence of these people, but he had no way of knowing whether they were all part of the commission because Vega only chose dealers who had never had any contact with any US federal agency, let alone the tangled web of power and politics that existed within them. The most striking example of someone who fell for this is Carlos Ramon Zapata, nicknamed El Médico, the doctor. He studied medicine in college, but later entered the drug trade, which brought in more money. However, El Médico never became a professional gangster and was very afraid of the law. In 1999, he gave Vega $6 million and surrendered to the US authorities in Miami, quickly realizing that Vega had simply handed him over to the Americans and had no intention of helping him get out of this situation unscathed. El Médico had to get himself out of this mess on his own, proving his worth, which he essentially succeeded in doing. He was released in 2005 after serving a very short sentence. You may have a reasonable question. How could Vega pull this trick over and over again without fearing that he would be killed? The thing is, he did it under the protection of other drug lords, Nicolas Bergonzoli, Julio Fierro, Don Berna, and Carlos and Vicente Castaño, taking only 30% of the proceeds for himself. All four of them, by the way, took an active part in the hunt for Pablo Escobar and were directly involved in Los Pepes, which kind of hints at the incredible level of collusion between crime and state that had developed in Colombia. Moreover, after the collapse of the Medellín Cartel, Don Berna organized his own organization called La Oficina de Envigado, which I'll discuss separately in another video. Thus, the string of drug dealers whom Vega first sent to Uncle Sam and who then fell into his hands under the pressure of general paranoia gave the Norte del Valle cartel its second name, the Cartel of Snitches. Vega's shop was only shut down in 2000 when he was arrested in his villa in Miami on charges of obstruction of justice and laundering money obtained through drug trafficking. $1.5 million and his private jet were seized, but Vega never served any real time, because if the case had gone to trial, it would have implicated many high-ranking individuals. Vega later even filed a lawsuit in hopes of recovering the seized funds, but his claim was denied. Inside the cartel, tensions were growing, not only because of informants, but also because of the struggle for power. Let me remind you of this power balance. On one side were Don Diego Montoya, Chupeta, Roscuño, and Victor Patiño. On the other side were El Jabón and the Henao brothers. There was Colonel Danilo Gonzalez with his Diablos cartel, which acted as a kind of patron. Everyone understood that sooner or later a war of all against all would begin, and they had to be ready for it. Varela was the first to form a combat wing. It was called Los Rastrojos, in honor of the commander Diego Perez Henao, nicknamed Rastrojo, and consisted of about 200 people. The second faction was not far behind. Don Diego's combat wing was called Los Machos and had a similar number of members. These groups found immediate use in 2003. Varela learned that a close associate of Don Diego was collaborating with the DEA, and with the help of Los Rastrojos had killed him. Don Diego did not know that his close associate was an informant and did not believe Varela's words, responding to this murder by using Los Machos to wipe out a group of people belonging to Los Rastrojos. This marked the beginning of a long-standing feud. Over the next 2 years, more than 1,000 people died in the conflict. Both sides financed this war by increasing cocaine exports not only to the United States, but also to Europe. During the conflict, Varela sent orders to several independent transporters to stop providing services to Don Diego's organization. Some agreed and some did not, which only deepened the rift. In December 2003, Don Diego's younger brother, Juan Carlos Montoya Sanchez, was arrested. He ran the family's drug processing labs. Along with him, the Colombian police arrested Carlos Felipe Toro Sanchez. He was involved in delivering drugs to the U.S. Both were deported to Miami and sentenced to long prison terms. Then a rumor spread throughout Norte del Valle that the person who had informed the police about them was none other than retired Colombian National Police Colonel Danilo Gonzalez. For many years, Danilo had maintained good relations with Don Diego, but as tensions grew, he switched sides to Wilber Varela. This, of course, caused serious discontent among Don Diego, but he did not take any immediate action as Gonzalez's power was too great. Meanwhile, the Diablos cartel boss had long been under surveillance and investigation, which he was aware of, as was everyone around him. The only way out, of course, was to surrender to the Americans and receive a short sentence in exchange for his invaluable testimony. It's not known whether he actually intended to surrender to the Americans, but even a hint of suspicion was enough. Don Diego took revenge on his old friend on March 25, 2004, when his hitmen killed Gonzalez in Bogota. By the end of 2004, Wilber Varela began hiding in Venezuela under the alias Jose Antonio Chacon. First, he was hiding from Don Diego, and second, the US government had put a $5 million bounty on his head. A little later, Don Diego himself ended up on the FBI's most wanted list and was forced to go into hiding. So at the end of the early 2000s, Rascuño, El Mocho, Florecita, El Médico, Chupeta, and a number of other major bosses of the Norte del Valle cartel were arrested and extradited. This scale of operation was made possible by the thing that had earned them their nickname, snitching. The cartel members were no longer bound by brotherly ties, and saving their lives so as not to spend the rest of their days in an American prison became their main goal. Varela and Don Diego remained at large. The denouement of this story came in 2007, when the Colombian newspaper El Tiempo revealed shocking facts. The military and police were turning off radars in exchange for bribes, allowing the cartel to transport drugs unhindered. The Navy was particularly affected. According to the paper, Admiral Gabriel Arango had used his influence to protect drug traffickers and was particularly friendly with Don Diego. He marked documents related to this activity with a secret logo in the form of a horseshoe. It later turned out that these were the cartel's routes along the Pacific and Caribbean coasts, through Ecuador, Panama, and Venezuela. This event increased pressure on the Colombian authorities, and in August 2007, Diego Montoya himself was arrested. On December 12, 2008, he was extradited to the US, where he was sentenced to 45 years in prison. But Varela's joy at this victory was short-lived. In January 2008, his body was found by a cleaning lady in a holiday home in a resort in the Venezuelan state of Merida. Varela's death was the result of several gunshot wounds. There are no signs of forced entry, and Varela clearly knew his killer, letting him in and having drinks with him. The press immediately speculated that Varela faked his death, because a year earlier he had already tried to do so when killers shot a man who looked very similar to him on the street. But the authorities confirmed that fingerprint evidence proved beyond a doubt that it was Varela. As usual, there are several theories about this murder. The first is a romantic conflict of passion with major drug dealer Carlos Mario Aguilar, whom he invited to Venezuela to settle their differences. The second is that El Jabón was ordered by his own people, Javier Antonio Calle Serna, nicknamed Comba, and Diego Rastrojo Henao, after he tried to prevent them from expanding their activities in the northern Colombian departments of Santander and Norte de Santander. As Los Rastrojos' influence grew, Varela began to lose control of his power wing, especially after Daniel Varela, nicknamed El Loco, joined the group and became part of the Rastrojos' senior leadership alongside the Comba brothers and Diego Rastrojo. El Loco Varela led operations in the eastern departments of Meta and Guaviare and controlled most of the international drug trade, while Diego Rastrojo commanded the rural areas. The Comba brothers worked in urban areas such as Cali, managing a network of hired assassins. While maintaining its traditional positions in Valle del Cauca, the group expanded its influence to neighboring Nariño and Cauca and strengthened its ties with guerrillas with the National Liberation Army, ELN. The group even managed to extend its influence to Antioquia, specifically to the Bajo Cauca subregion, where, despite the presence of such competitors as the Urabeños group, they were able to take control of production labs and key trafficking routes in the north of the country. They planned to expand further, but their former boss stood in their way. After Varela's death, his former armed wing became one of the most influential players in drug trafficking, extortion, and kidnapping. And by 2010, Los Rastrojos became Colombia's most powerful crime organization. However, by 2013, the group had disbanded with the arrest of its top leaders. Despite this, small cells of Los Rastrojos remained in some departments. The cells in Valle del Cauca eventually evolved into more local structures, remaining themselves La Inmaculada, the Immaculate, and settling in Tuluá, a city in the northern part of the department. They merged with local gangs and became an influential criminal group involved in drug trafficking, extortion, and corruption in local government. In Barranquilla, a port city on the Caribbean coast, there was another group known as the Costeños, or Oficina de la Costa. They were involved in debt collection, contract killings, and extortion until they broke up in 2021. This split led to the emergence of another group called Rastrojos Costeños, the Coastal Rastrojos, which is a reference to the original group. The Norte de Santander group managed to revive Los Trojos and become stronger thanks to resources obtained from drug trafficking, smuggling, and other criminal activities on the border with Venezuela. The revival of the Rastrojos attracted the attention of rival crime groups seeking to take over their territory. Starting in 2015, Los Rastrojos fought fiercely with their longtime enemies, the Urabeños, for control of the municipalities of Cucata and Puerto Santander. By 2017, the Rastrojos had declared victory and even expanded their influence to the Venezuelan state of Táchira, but their dominance was short-lived. At that time, the ELN, a left-wing rebel group, also began expanding into Rastrojos territory. By 2019, a direct confrontation had begun, running parallel to internal conflicts. At the same time, the National Liberation Army also attacked Los Rastrojos. In 2020, the Bolivarian National Armed Forces of Venezuela, FANB, also joined the conflict against Los Rastrojos. From that moment on, Rastrojos lost their presence in Venezuela, and their influence in Norte de Santander significantly decreased. In 2021, in a desperate attempt to stay afloat, the Rastrojos turned to their former enemies, the Urabeños, now known as the Gaitanist Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, AGC, in their fight against the ELN in Norte de Santander. Various splinter groups that emerged from the decline of the Los Trojos remain active in some other parts of Colombia, including the Rastrojos Costeños in Barranquilla and La Inmaculada in Valle del Cauca. In 2025, the mayor of the municipality of Rio Frio in Valle de Cauca reported receiving death threats from a gang calling itself the Nueva Generación de los Rastrojos, the new generation of the Rastrojos. The group is believed to include former members of the Los Trojos who were never arrested and continued to participate in the drug trade even after the group disbanded. They are currently active and continue their criminal activities. The drug war in Colombia shows no signs of ending. As one of the agents who worked with the cartel of snitches said, "You arrest people, you make a cooperation agreement, and they hand over others to you." I think this can go on forever, and it will go on forever. We take away one important person and another one immediately appears. However, during its heyday, Norte del Valle was the last cartel in Colombia that controlled the entire drug supply chain, from the coca bush to retail sales in the ghettos of New York. Finally, let's take a closer look at how their business was organized. Unlike Medellín and Cali, the Norte del Valle cartel was a loose confederation of drug trafficking organizations that formed alliances, invested in each other's shipments, fought each other, and killed each other, but still united to keep outsiders out of their territory. Overall, they did not come up with anything new in the business. Norte del Valle's drug business was based on the best practices of their predecessors. Corruption networks, connections in all strata of society, close acquaintances and regular payments to politicians, and municipal and federal police on the payroll. But they took cooperation with their European colleagues to a new level. Norte cells operated throughout Europe, and of all the Colombian cartels, they were perhaps the most successful, forming a number of important alliances that, by all accounts, are still in place today. The cartel's activities also contributed to the creation of a number of new effective routes for drug trafficking, which are also still in use today. In particular, speedboats and fishing vessels were used to transport cocaine from the Pacific coast of Colombia to Mexico, where it was picked up by Mexican allies, mainly Beltrán Leiva's organization, which transported it to the United States. According to estimates by the Drug Enforcement Administration, by 2005 the cartel had exported more than 500 tons of cocaine, worth more than $10 billion since the 1990s via this route. A little later, it became known that the close ties between Roscuño, one of the bosses of the Norte del Valle cartel, and Miguel Ángel Trevino, one of the leaders of Los Zetas. In early 2000, authorities learned that Norte del Valle's businesses included not only drug-moving networks, but also oficinas de cobro, or collection agencies, Colombian criminal organizations that provided services to drug traffickers, primarily debt collection and contract killings. One of the most notorious Colombian oficinas, which operated successfully not only in Colombia but also in Spain, was known as Los Señores del Aquiro, the Lords of Acid, and was based in Madrid. The newspaper El Espectador reported how Colombians created this network to take the Oficina de Envigado model of organized crime. The original Colombian oficina created to collect debts for Pablo Escobar in Medellín and export the model to Spain. The Lords of Acid were led from Colombia by Luis Dávalos Jiménez, nicknamed Pampo, a member of the Norte del Valle cartel. Hitmen from this group were involved in kidnappings, murders, debt collection, and extortion. The group got its name after dissolving the decapitated corpse of a drug dealer's relative who had an outstanding debt in acid. Thus, it can be assumed that despite internal strife, the Norte del Valle cartel was diversifying its business, as were their colleagues in Mexico, and all this time, since 1993, it had not stopped developing, capturing more and more new markets. The U.S. authorities were not idle meanwhile, uncovering Don Diego's money laundering network, which his younger brother, Eugenio, had built through a series of front companies in the British Virgin Islands. The FBI in Florida confiscated 2 luxury oceanfront condos worth $2.5 million and an 80-foot yacht worth $3.5 million. The Bureau had gotten too close, and this really shook Don Diego, who had already been charged in Florida. It also upset his family, and most of them fled back to Colombia. In 2006, thanks to the work of cartel informants, U.S. government auditors compiled what they believed to be a complete list of assets owned or otherwise controlled by 19 members of the Norte del Valle cartel. The cartel members were involved in agriculture, aviation, cattle and horse breeding, consulting, construction, distribution, financial management, hospitality, investment, manufacturing, mining, pharmaceuticals, real estate, and shipping. More than 1,000 businesses and real estate properties were seized, as well as hundreds of other assets totaling well over $1 billion. At the moment, there are simply no groups of this scale in Colombia. Does this mean that the drug trade has ceased? No. Cocaine, which used to generate revenues comparable to the annual budgets of some countries, is no longer the most popular drug. The work of the DEA has led to a real decrease in its importation to the United States, because there are no longer any large corporations in Colombia capable of flooding the country with powder. But the drugs consumed in the US are now completely different, supplied from Mexico and China. Cocaine has once again become an elite drug, and at the moment, Colombians are cooperating much more closely with Europe than with the US, strange as it may sound. However, at the end of 2025, when this script was written, there was a decline in cocaine prices. After surrendering in 2016, FARC rebels doubled their coca plantations, and a gram of pure Colombian powder now costs only 40 euros at retail. Although just a few years ago, you had to pay at least 100 for it. This drop in prices, in turn, is leading to the arrival of new customers, who are already tired of Chinese chemicals, and who knows, maybe another cocaine boom is ahead of us. From a historical perspective, Norte del Valle has become an example for all subsequent generations of drug dealers. Their relatively short and turbulent history shows that dedication and loyalty are the most valuable assets in the shadow business, and that it's not the DEA that should be truly feared, but the rats within one's own organization.